Good evening. I'm Tom Wilkinson. I'm the history editor of the Architectural Review and an early career fellow at the Warburg Institute. And tonight I'm joining you as part of the Architecture Foundation's Bedtime Stories series, which has been curated by Alicia Pivaro. And I'd like to say thank you to Alicia for inviting me to take part in the programme. This evening I'm going to be reading to you from Thomas Bernhard's 1985 novel, Old Masters. Bernhard was perhaps the greatest Austrian writer of the later 20th century and certainly the most scathing. He was also one of the funniest writers in any language. This is laughter in the dark, however. Bernhard had a very unpleasant childhood and suffered all his life from a lung condition which he eventually killed himself to escape. His characters too are afflicted by death and suffering. But perhaps their greatest affliction is Austria, which Bernhard regarded with disgust. In his play Heldenplatz, written to mark the 50th anniversary of the Anschluss, Bernhard called the Austrians Nazis and described the country as a brutal and stupid nation, a mindless, cultureless sewer which spreads its penetrating stench all over Europe. Jörg Haider called for the play to be banned, a high accolade in anyone's book. Bernhard's opinion of Austria, which could quite fittingly be applied to Great Britain, is not the only reason I have chosen to read from this book. The plot, such as it is, concerns an aging music critic called Reger, who goes every day to the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna to sit in front of Tintoretto's painting, A White-Bearded Man. He is joined there by an old friend, the book's narrator, and together the two bitch about their contemporaries, art historians, books, and, naturally, Austria. And who today doesn't dream of meeting old friends when we're finally released back into the wild, to sit down, perhaps in a gallery, and to bitch? But apart from this utopian vision, the book is also filled with nuggets which, despite their absurd over-egging, might also contain something close to wisdom. This, despite the fact that Reger is, as you'll see, insufferable, ridiculous, and not a little reprehensible. There is one more thing you should know about him. Reger is recently bereaved, and Bernhard, when he wrote Old Masters, had just lost the woman he called his Lebensmensch, his life's person, Hedwig Stawianicek, who was 40 years his senior and whom, he said, had been the most important person in his life since he was 19. The first passage I'm going to read to you from Old Masters advises an attitude to art and to life which is, in my opinion, both sympathetic and consoling, but not in the idiotic Alain de Botton sense of the word. He who reads everything has understood nothing, he said. It is not necessary to read all of Goethe or all of Kant. It is not necessary to read all of Schopenhauer. A few pages of Werther, a few pages of Elective Affinities, and we know more in the end about the two books than if we had read them from beginning to end, which would anyway deprive us of the purest enjoyment. But such drastic self-restraint requires so much courage and such strength of mind as can only rarely be mustered, and as we ourselves muster only rarely. The reading person, just as the carnivorous, is gluttonous in the most revolting manner, and, like the carnivorous person, upsets his stomach and his entire health, his head and his whole intellectual existence. We even understand a philosophical essay better if we do not gobble it up entirely and at one go, but pick out a detail from which we then arrive at the whole, if we are lucky. Our greatest pleasure, surely, is in fragments. just as we derive the most pleasure from life if we regard it as a fragment, whereas the whole and the complete and perfect are basically abhorrent to us. Only when we are fortunate enough to turn something whole, something complete, or indeed perfect into a fragment, when we get down to reading it, only then do we experience a high degree, at times indeed a supreme degree, of pleasure in it. Our age has long been intolerable as a whole, he said. Only when we perceive a fragment of it is it tolerable to us. The whole and the perfect are intolerable, he said. That is why, fundamentally, all of these paintings here in the Kunsthistorisches Museum are intolerable, if I am to be honest. They are abhorrent to me. In order to be able to bear them, I search for a so-called massive mistake in and about every single one of them. A procedure which so far has always obtained its objective of turning that so-called perfect work of art into a fragment, he said. The perfect not only threatens us ceaselessly with our ruin, it also ruins everything that is hanging on these walls under the label of masterpiece. I proceed from the assumption that there is no such thing as the perfect or the whole, and each time I have made a fragment of one of these so-called perfect works of art hanging here on the walls by searching for a massive mistake in and about that work of art, for the crucial point of failure by the artist who made that work of art, searching for it until I have found it, I have got one step further. In every one of these paintings, these so-called masterpieces, I have found and uncovered a massive mistake, the failure of its creator. For over 30 years this, as you might think, infamous calculation has come out right. Not one of these world-famous masterpieces, no matter by whom, is in fact whole or perfect. That reassures me. It makes me basically happy. Only when, time and again, we have discovered that there is no such thing as the whole or the perfect, are we able to live on. We cannot endure the whole or the perfect. We have to travel to Rome to discover that St. Peter's is a tasteless concoction, that Bernini's altar is an architectural nonsense. We have to see the Pope face to face and personally discover that all in all, he is just as hopeless and grotesque a person as anyone else in order to be able to bear it. We have to listen to Bach and hear how he fails, listen to Beethoven and hear how he fails, even listen to Mozart and hear how he fails. And we have to deal in the same way with the so-called great philosophers, even if they are our favourite spiritual artists, he said. After all, we do not love Pascal because he is so perfect, but because he is fundamentally so helpless, just as we love Montaigne for his helplessness in lifelong searching and failing to find, and Voltaire for his helplessness. We only love philosophy and the humanities generally because they are absolutely helpless. We truly love only those books which are not a whole, which are chaotic, which are helpless. The same is true of everything and everybody, Reger said. We only feel particularly attached to a person because he is helpless and not a whole, because he is chaotic and not perfect. Yes, I say, El Greco, fine, but the good man did not know how to paint a hand. And I say, Veronese, fine, but the good man of course did not know how to paint a natural face. And what I said to you about the fugue today, he was saying yesterday, not one of all the composers, even the greatest, composed a perfect one, not even Bach, who surely was tranquility itself and pure compositional clarity. There is no perfect picture, and there is no perfect book, and there is no perfect piece of music, Reger said. That is the truth. And this truth makes it possible for a mind like mine, which all its life was nothing but a desperate mind to go on existing. One's mind has to be a searching mind, a mind searching for mistakes, for the mistakes of humanity, a mind searching for failure. The next part of the book I'm going to read begins with an excoriation of the Austrian writer Adalbert Stifter, who I don't suppose anybody reads in English, and then it segues into a denunciation of Heidegger, who is read by far too many architects. Sentimentality altogether, that is the terrible thing, is now greatly in vogue, just as everything else that is kitsch is now greatly in vogue. From the mid-70s to this day in the mid-80s, sentimentality and kitsch have been greatly in vogue in literature, in painting, and also in music. Never before has so much sentimental kitsch been written as now in the 80s. Never before has there been so much kitschy and sentimental painting. And the composers are vying with each other in kitsch and sentimentality. You only need to go to the theatre, where nothing is staged nowadays except dangerous kitsch, nothing except sentimentality. And even when there is brutality and savagery on the stage, it is still nothing but common, kitschy sentimentality. You need only go to an exhibition, and all that is shown to you there is extreme kitsch and the most revolting sentimentality. You need only go to the concert halls, and there too you will hear nothing but kitsch and sentimentality. The books today are crammed full of kitsch and sentimentality. That is what made Stifter so fashionable in recent years. Stifter is a master of kitsch, Reger said. On any page of Stifter that you care to pick, there is so much kitsch that several generations of poetry-hungry nuns and nurses can be satiated with it, he said. And, in actual fact, Bruckner too is nothing but sentimental and kitschy. Nothing but stupid, monumental, orchestrated, sickly earwax. The young and the very young writers working today mostly write nothing but brainless and mindless kitsch, and in their books they develop a positively unbearable, bombastic sentimentality. It is therefore easy to understand why Stifter is the height of fashion for them too. Stifter, who introduced brainless and mindless kitsch into great and noble literature, and who ended up committing a kitschy suicide, is now the height of fashion, Reger said. It is by no means incomprehensible that just now, when the word forest and the word forest death have so much come into vogue, and when altogether the notion of forest is the most used and the most misused notion of all, Stifter's tall forest is being bought in greater numbers than ever before. People today yearn for nature more than they have done ever before, and because everyone believes that Stifter has described nature, they all run to Stifter. But Stifter has not described nature at all, he has only kitschified it. The whole stupidity of people is revealed in the fact that they are all now making pilgrimages to Stifter in their hundreds of thousands, kneeling down before every one of his books as if every one of them were an altar. It is in this kind of pseudo-enthusiasm, more than in anything else, that I find humanity distasteful, Reger said. I find it absolutely repulsive. In the end, everything eventually becomes a prey to ridicule, or at least a triviality, no matter how great and important it may be. Stifter, in fact, always reminds me of Heidegger, of that ridiculous Nazi Philistine in +4s. Just as Stifter has totally and in the most shameless manner kitschified great literature, so Heidegger, the Black Forest philosopher Heidegger, has kitschified philosophy. Heidegger and Stifter, each one for himself and in his own way, have hopelessly kitschified philosophy and literature. Heidegger, after whom the wartime and post-war generations have been chasing, showering him with revolting and stupid doctoral theses even in his lifetime, I always visualize him sitting on his wooden bench outside his Black Forest house, alongside his wife who, with her perverse knitting enthusiasm, ceaselessly knits winter socks for him from the wool she has herself shorn from their own Heidegger sheep. I cannot visualize Heidegger other than sitting on the bench outside his Black Forest house, alongside his wife, who all her life totally dominated him and who knitted all his socks and crocheted all his caps and who baked all his bread and wove all his bed linen and who even cobbled up his sandals for him. Heidegger was a kitschy brain, Reger said, just as Stifter, but actually a lot more ridiculous than Stifter, who was in fact a tragic figure, unlike Heidegger, who was always merely comical, just as petty bourgeois as Stifter, just as disastrously megalomaniac, a feeble thinker from the Alpine foothills, I believe, and just about right for the German philosophical hot pot. For decades, they ravenously spooned up that man Heidegger, more than anyone else, and overloaded their German philological and philosophical stomachs with his stuff. Heidegger had a common face, not a spiritual one, Reger said. He was through and through an unspiritual person, devoid of all fantasy, devoid of all sensibility, a genuine German philosophical ruminant, a ceaselessly gravid German philosophical cow, Reger said, which grazed upon German philosophy and thereupon for decades let its smart little cowpats drop. Heidegger, in a manner of speaking, was a philosophical conman, Reger said, who succeeded in getting a whole generation of German philosophers to stand on their heads. Heidegger is a revolting episode in the history of German philosophy, Reger said yesterday, an episode in which all philosophical Germans participated and still participate. To this day, Heidegger has still not been entirely exposed to what he is. True, the Heidegger cow has become thinner, but the Heidegger cow is still being milked. Heidegger, in his worn +4s in front of that lie of a log cabin at Todnauberg, is all I have left as an unmasking photograph. The philosophical Philistine, with his crocheted Black Forest cap on his head, under which, when all is said and done, nothing but German feeble-mindedness is warmed up over and over again, Reger said. By the time we are old, we have undergone a great many murderous fashions, all those murderous fashions in art and in philosophy and in consumer goods. Heidegger is a good example of how nothing is left of a fashion in philosophy which at one time had gripped the whole of Germany. Nothing left but a number of ridiculous photographs and a number of even more ridiculous writings. Heidegger was a philosophical market crier who only brought stolen goods to the market. Everything of Heidegger's is second-hand. He was and is the prototype of the rethinker, who lacked everything, but truly everything, for independent thinking. Heidegger's method consisted in the most unscrupulous turning of other people's great ideas into small ideas of his own. That is a fact. Heidegger has so reduced everything great that it has become German compatible. You understand? German compatible, Reger said. Heidegger is the petty bourgeois of German philosophy, the man who has placed on German philosophy his kitschy nightcap, that kitschy black nightcap which Heidegger always wore on all occasions. Heidegger is the carpet slipper and nightcap philosopher of the Germans, nothing else. I don't know why, Reger said yesterday. Whenever I think of Stifter, I also think of Heidegger, and the other way about. Surely it is no accident, Reger said, that Heidegger, just as Stifter, has always been popular and is still popular mainly with those tense women. And just as those fussy do-gooding nuns and those fussy do-gooding nurses devour Stifter as their favourite dish, in a manner of speaking, so they also devour Heidegger. Heidegger to this day is the favourite philosopher of German womanhood. Heidegger is the women's philosopher, the specially suitable luncheon philosopher straight from the scholar's frying pan. When you come to a petit bourgeois or even an aristocratic petit bourgeois party, you are very often served Heidegger even before the hors d'oeuvre. You have not even taken off your overcoat, and already you are being offered a piece of Heidegger. You have not even sat down, and already the lady of the house has brought Heidegger in with the sherry on a silver salver. Heidegger is invariably a well-cooked German philosophy which may be served anywhere and at any time, Reger said, in any household. I do not know of any philosopher today who has been more degraded, Reger said. Anyway, Heidegger is finished as far as philosophy is concerned. Whereas 10 years ago he was still the great thinker, he now, as it were, only haunts pseudo-intellectual households and pseudo-intellectual parties, adding an artificial mendaciousness to their entirely natural one. Like Stifter, Heidegger is a tasteless and readily digestible reader's pudding for the mediocre German mind. Heidegger has no more to do with intellect than Stifter has to do with poetry, believe me. And as far as philosophy and poetry are concerned, the two of them are worth nothing, although I still value Stifter more highly than Heidegger, who has always repelled me, because everything about Heidegger has always been repulsive to me. Not only the nightcap on his head, and his homespun winter long johns above the stove, which he himself had lit at Tottenauberg, not only his Black Forest walking stick, which he himself had whittled. In fact, his entire hand-whittled Black Forest philosophy, everything about that tragicomical man has always been repulsive to me, has always profoundly repulsed me, whenever I even thought of it. I only had to know a single line of Heidegger to feel repulsed, let alone when reading Heidegger, Reger said. I have always thought of Heidegger as a charlatan who merely utilised everything around him and who, during that utilisation, sunned himself on his bench at Tottenauberg. When I think that even super-intelligent people have been taken in by Heidegger, and that even one of my best women friends wrote a dissertation about Heidegger, and, moreover, wrote that dissertation quite seriously, I feel sick to this day, Reger said. His "nothing is without reason" is the most ludicrous thing ever, Reger said. But the Germans are impressed by posturing, Reger said. The Germans have an interest in posturing. That is one of their most striking characteristics. And as for the Austrians, they are a lot worse still in all these respects. I have seen a series of photographs which a supremely talented woman photographer made of Heidegger, who in all of them looked like a retired, bloated staff officer, Reger said. In these photographs, Heidegger is just climbing out of bed, or Heidegger is climbing into bed, or Heidegger is sleeping, or waking up, putting on his underpants, pulling on his socks, taking a sip of grape juice, stepping out of his log cabin and looking towards the horizon, whittling away at his stick, putting on his cap, taking off his cap, holding his cap in his hands, opening out his legs, raising his head, lowering his head, putting his right hand in his wife's left hand, while his wife is putting her left hand in his right hand, walking in front of his house, walking at the back of his house, walking towards his house, walking away from his house, reading, eating, spooning his soup, cutting a slice of bread baked by himself, opening a book written by himself, closing a book written by himself, bending down, straightening up, and so on, Reger said. Enough to make you throw up. If the Wagnerians are more than flesh and blood can bear, what about the Heideggerians? Reger said. But of course Heidegger cannot be compared to Wagner, who really was a genius, a man to whom the concept of genius really applies more than anyone else, whereas Heidegger has always only been a small philosophical rear-rank man. Heidegger, that much is clear, was the most pampered German philosopher of the century, and simultaneously the most insignificant. The people who made pilgrimages to Heidegger were mainly those who confused philosophy with culinary science, who regarded philosophy as something fried and roasted and cooked, which is entirely in line with German taste. Heidegger used to hold court at Todtnauberg and at all times would allow himself to be admired on his philosophical Black Forest plinth like a sacred cow. Even a famous and much feared North German publisher of periodicals kneeled before him devotionally and open-mouthed, as though, in a manner of speaking, he was expecting the host of the spirit from Heidegger sitting there under the setting sun on his bench before his house. All these people made their pilgrimages to Todtnauberg to see Heidegger and made themselves look ridiculous, Reger said. They made their pilgrimages, as it were, into the philosophical Black Forest, to the sacred Mount Heidegger, and knelt down before their idol. That their idol was a total spiritual washout, that they could not know with their dull-wittedness. They did not even suspect it, Reger said. Nevertheless, the Heidegger episode is revealing as an example of the German cult of philosophers. They invariably cling to the false ones, Reger said, to those who suit them best, to the stupid and the suspect ones. But the most terrible thing is that I am related to both of them, to Stifter on my mother's side, and to Heidegger on my father's side, and that is positively grotesque. The last little nugget I'm going to read to you from Old Masters is also on the subject of art. Even Mozart did not escape kitsch. Especially in the operas, there is so much kitsch. The coy and the frisky often turn somersaults in the most unbearable way in those superficial operas. A turtle dove here, a turtle dove there, a raised forefinger here, a raised forefinger there, that too is Mozart, Reger said. Mozart's music is also full of petticoat and frilly undies kitsch, he said. And the state composer Beethoven, as the Tempest Sonata above all demonstrates, is positively ridiculously serious. But where would it get us if we subjected everything to this deadly kind of examination, Reger said. Fussiness and kitsch, after all, are the two principal characteristics of so-called civilized man, highly stylized as he has become into a single human grotesque over hundreds and thousands of years, he said. Anything human is kitschy, he said. There can be no doubt about that, and so is high art and the highest art. That has been me, Tom Wilkinson, reading to you from Thomas Bernhard's novel Old Masters, and I hope, if nothing else, he's given you a new word, frilly undies kitsch, Höschen kitsch in German. This has been the Bedtime Stories series for the Architecture Foundation. Good night.